In the second week of June, 1898, an American invasion fleet sat motionless in Tampa Bay for 5 days. 16,000 soldiers waited below its decks in wool uniforms, the meat spoiling on the docks behind them, while 12,000 more were left ashore for want of ships. The army was 30,000 strong, and the town it had descended on, fed by a single railroad, emptied through a single port, had held fewer than 800 people a generation before. Every rail that carried those men in, every ship meant to carry them out, and the Moorish palace where the generals waited out the delay in rocking chairs on the veranda, all of it belonged to one man. His name was Henry Bradley Plant. In 20 years, he had laid 2,100 miles of track, folded 14 railroads into a single system, run steamships to Havana and Key West, built 8 hotels along an empty coast, and spent $2.5 million of his own money on that palace, with its 511 rooms and its 13 silver minarets. The western half of Florida moved because he willed it. Now the whole weight of a war had settled onto his one railroad and his one port. What happened at that pier, and why within 3 years his name would be scraped from every rail he ever laid, is the story that follows. Chapter 1. The Other Henry. Today the palace is a school. On the west bank of the Hillsborough River, in the middle of downtown Tampa, the 13 silver minarets still stand, each one crowned with a crescent moon, catching the Gulf light exactly as they were built to. Beneath them, where Gilded Age travelers once stepped down from private railcars and dressed for dinner in a Moorish grand salon, students now cross the lawns between classes. The building is called Plant Hall, and it is the heart of the University of Tampa. Its silver minarets are the signature of the Tampa skyline, printed on postcards and diplomas, and the letterhead of a university that did not exist when the last hotel guest checked out. Tens of thousands of visitors tour the museum preserved in one wing every year. Almost none of them arrive knowing the name of the man who built it. When the hotel opened, in the winter of 1891, the newspapers of the day could hardly find words grand enough for it. It was, one wrote, brightly illuminated, filled with sumptuous decorations, thrilling music, and graced with turrets, domes, and minarets towering heavenward and glistening in the sun. A visiting writer called the interior a jewel casket into which has been gathered an infinite number of gems. The man who had ordered every stone of it laid, and paid for the whole of it out of his own pocket, would within a single generation become the least remembered figure in the story of how Florida was made. His name was Henry Bradley Plant, and in the 1880s and 1890s he built the western half of a state. He laid more than 2,000 miles of railroad, ran a fleet of steamships to Havana and Key West, and raised a string of grand hotels along a Gulf coast that had been all but empty, and in that same stretch of years, on the opposite side of the peninsula, another man was doing the identical thing, the same decade, the same design, the opposite shore. The other Henry was Henry Flagler, the Standard Oil partner whose name today marks a county, a college, a museum, and the resort coast of Palm Beach that he built. Plant's name marks a small farming town east of Tampa, a single museum wing, and the hall the students walk through without looking up. 2 men did the same work at the same time in the same state. The record kept one of them and let the other go. The forgetting is not for lack of a monument. Plant left one of the most conspicuous buildings in the American South, and it is still standing, still admired, still in daily use. What was forgotten was never the palace. It was the empire the palace had been built to advertise. The railroads and the steamships, the deep-water port he dredged out of a mudflat, the fishing village of a few hundred people that he turned into a city. And it was forgotten with unusual speed. A man does not often assemble a transportation empire across an entire region and then watch it disappear, name and all, within 3 years of his own death. Plant did. The rails themselves outlived the name that laid them. Much of the track he assembled still carries freight across Georgia and Florida today under the initials of a company founded long after he was gone. The steel remained. The man was scraped off it. What this story sets out to trace is not why Henry Plant is unknown. It is how a man that powerful could be erased that completely, and what the empire cost, climbing to its height and falling from it, that the silver minarets have never been asked to answer for. To follow that, the story has to go back, past the palace, past the railroads, past the war that filled every room in the hotel for the only week in its history, to a farmhouse in Connecticut, and a boy who lost almost everything he had before he was old enough to know the shape of what he had lost. Before it does, one thing worth asking: 2 men named Henry built Florida in the same 20 years, and the record kept only one of them. Tell me in the comments whether you had ever heard the name Henry Plant before tonight, and if you have stood under those 13 minarets yourself, or sat through a class inside them, say so, and tell me what you were told the building used to be. Chapter 2. A Boy on the Water. The farmhouse stood in Branford, Connecticut, a few miles east of New Haven, and Henry Bradley Plant was born in it on the 27th of October, 1819. His father, Anderson Plant, was a farmer in comfortable circumstances, descended from an Englishman who had settled in Hartford nearly 2 centuries before. By every ordinary measure, it was a life that should have stayed on that farm. It did not. When the boy was 6 years old, fever came through the house and took his father and a younger sister, and left Henry the surviving child of a family that had, in a season, lost half of itself. He grew up in the shadow of that arithmetic, of how quickly a settled world can be reduced, and of how little in it is guaranteed to last. His mother remarried and moved the household first to Martinsburg in upstate New York, and then back to New Haven, where Henry attended a private school. His grandmother, a devout woman, had settled on a future for him. She would pay his way through Yale College, and he would enter the ministry. It was a respectable path, and a funded one, and he turned it down. What he wanted was not a pulpit, but a deck. He took work instead as a captain's boy on the steamboats of the New Haven Steamboat Company, running the water between New Haven and New York, and there, at the very bottom of the business, he found the one thing he was good at. The thing was cargo that nobody else troubled to think about. Among a steamboat's duties was the carrying of express parcels, small, valuable, urgent shipments, and the line handled them carelessly, as an afterthought to the freight that mattered. Plant did not handle them carelessly. He organized the express traffic, systematized it, made it fast, and made it certain, and when the Adams Express Company absorbed the route and moved the express business off the water and onto the new railroads, it took Plant along with it and put him in charge of its New York office. He had discovered before he was 30 the principle that would carry him for the rest of his life. The largest fortunes were not made in the things everyone already valued. They were made in the neglected thing, the overlooked route, the business a careless man threw away. He would spend the next 40 years finding neglected things and closing his hand around them. In 1842, he had married Ellen Blackstone, a Connecticut woman, They had 2 children, and only one, a son named Morton, would live to grow up. In 1853, Ellen fell ill, and her physicians gave the instruction that doctors of that era gave to the consumptive and the failing: go south, into the warmth. Plant took her to Florida. It was not yet a destination. It was a frontier of sand and slash pine and standing heat, a state laced with rivers and almost nothing else, with barely a railroad in it and few roads worth the name, where a sick woman and her ambitious husband spent several months near the hamlet of Jacksonville. Ellen had gone south to be saved. She was not. She would die in 1861 before a single mile of what her husband would see in that country was ever built. But in those months, the shrewd Yankee looked at the emptiness of Florida and did not see emptiness. He saw exactly what he had seen in a steamboat's forgotten parcels. He saw a neglected thing that no one had yet troubled to organize, and this one was the size of a state. The next year, in 1854, the Adams Express Company made him general superintendent of its entire southern division, the vast territory below the Potomac and the Ohio rivers, and moved him to Augusta, Georgia. He was now the man who moved the South, its parcels, its payrolls, its bank drafts, its private correspondence. All of it ran across the region through the network he ran, and he came to know that network the way a surgeon knows a body. It was an enormous responsibility and an enormously useful one, and it set a Connecticut Yankee at the very center of the Southern economy at the precise moment the Southern economy was preparing to leave the United States. When the war came, the company that carried the South's money would become one of the most valuable instruments the Confederacy possessed. What Henry Plant chose to do with it would make his first fortune and leave the first stain on it. Chapter 3. The Confederate Express. When the Southern states began to leave the Union in the winter of 1860 and 1861, the directors of the Adams Express Company in the North faced a problem of property. Their firm was a northern corporation, and a great deal of its business, its offices and routes, its wagons and safes and contracts, lay south of a line that was about to become the border of a war. Confiscation was coming, and so they made the decision that handed Henry Plant his first empire. Rather than lose the Southern Division to the Confederacy, they would sell it to the man who already ran it. The terms were extraordinary. In a meeting in Plant's Augusta office in April of 1861, the Adams Express Company agreed to transfer all of its southern assets to Plant, and Plant paid nothing. He signed 5 personal promissory notes of $100,000 each, $500,000 in paper, and no cash changed hands at all. In a single afternoon, on credit, a salaried superintendent became the owner of an entire regional express network. He organized it that year as the Southern Express Company, a Georgia corporation with a handful of Southern stockholders and himself as president. The neglected thing he closed his hand around this time was the machinery that moved money across a nation at war, and the nation at war paid him to run it. Because Plant had built a name for reliability, the cabinet of the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, made the Southern Express Company the official agent of the Confederacy for collecting its tariffs and transferring its funds. For the length of the war, the money of the rebellion, its customs revenue, its government remittances, its soldiers' pay, moved across the South through the company of a Connecticut Yankee. It was the same kind of express network that, little more than a decade earlier, an enslaved man named Henry Brown had used to mail himself out of Richmond in a wooden crate and into freedom in the North. Now the southern half of that machinery belonged to Plant, and it was carrying the funds of a government fighting to keep nearly 4 million people enslaved. The scale of the arrangement was its own quiet statement. a $500,000 network handed over for 5 signatures and not a dollar in cash. The express business of the whole South folded into a single Georgia corporation in a single year. The customs revenue and the treasury of an entire seceded nation, moving for 4 years under the contract of one man. And that man, by his own later account, had never wanted secession, professed sympathies with the Union, and did not believe in the cause his company was underwriting. It made no difference to the ledger. The contract was sound and the contract was his, and Henry Plant did with it what Henry Plant always did with a lucrative and neglected thing. He kept it. He did not, however, keep his place at the center of it. By 1863, with the war grinding into its worst years and the criticism mounting, a Northern-born man, grown rich on the Confederacy's money, made an easy target. Plant claimed a serious illness. He obtained a safe passage document signed for President Davis, left his home in Augusta, and sailed for Bermuda. From there he went on to Canada, and then to England and France, and there, comfortably abroad, he waited out the remainder of the war that was destroying the country his fortune had been made in. While the South starved and burned, its currency dissolving into worthless paper and its railroads torn up as fast as they had been laid, the man who had carried its money sat in Europe and let the fire burn down. When it had, in the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was gone, its money was ash, and the Southern Railroad network was a wreckage of bent rails, burned trestles, and bankrupt companies. Nearly everything Plant had spent the war moving had been annihilated. Whole railroads had ceased to exist. The ones that survived were insolvent, their stock worthless, their bonds in default, their track rusting where the armies had left it. And yet Plant himself walked out of the ruin untouched. The Southern Express Company still in his hands, his fortune still under his name, his health apparently recovered the moment the shooting stopped. He returned to a prostrate South and stood over it the way he had once stood over a steamboat's forgotten parcels. He had spent his whole life recognizing a single thing, a valuable asset that everyone else had given up for lost. Now an entire region lay in front of him, ruined and foreclosed and available for pennies on the dollar. Henry Plant came home from Europe and began, methodically, to buy it. Chapter 4. Buying the Ruins. He bought the way he had always bought, quietly, cheaply, and at the moment of maximum distress. The Depression of 1873 had driven much of the Southern rail network into bankruptcy, and the war had wrecked what the Depression did not. Foreclosure sales were being held across the region, and at them a ruined railroad could be had for a fraction of what it had cost to build. Where other men saw worthless paper and rusted track, Plant saw the thing he had spent his life learning to see. An asset the world had written off, priced far below what it was worth to a man patient enough to wait for the South to rise again. He was convinced it would rise. He intended to own the rails when it did. The buying began in earnest in 1879. The Atlantic and Gulf Railroad of Georgia had gone bankrupt 2 years earlier. That November, Plant took it at foreclosure and reorganized it as the Savannah, Florida, and Western Railway. The following year, 1880, he bought the Charleston and Savannah Railroad and rebuilt it, carrying his reach up the coast to Charleston, South Carolina. These 2 lines were the nucleus. Around them, one foreclosure at a time, one insolvent charter at a time, he began to assemble the rest. To manage what he was accumulating, Plant did in 1882 what the great consolidators of the age were learning to do. He built a holding company. The Plant Investment Company was a single corporate hand into which the railroads, and soon the steamships, and soon the hotels, could all be gathered and managed as one. It was the instrument that turned a collection of bankrupt lines into a system, and it was capitalized in part by some of the largest fortunes in the North. One of those fortunes will already be familiar. When Henry Plant organized the Plant Investment Company, among the Northern capitalists who put money into it was Henry Morrison Flagler, the Standard Oil partner who, in those very same years, was beginning to build his own empire of railroads and resorts down the opposite coast of Florida. The two men were rivals in the way that only men doing the identical thing can be rivals, and they were, at the same time, quietly associates. Flagler's Standard Oil money helped capitalize the company that built the Western Coast. The East Coast Henry helped fund the West Coast Henry, and the two of them spent the 1880s racing each other down opposite shores of the same state. History would remember the race as Flagler's. It had been, at the starting line, financed in part by Flagler himself. What the money built was staggering in its reach. Within 20 years of the first foreclosure, the plant system had grown to 14 separate railway companies operating more than 2,100 miles of track. It ran several steamship lines. It would raise 8 grand hotels. Its rails ran unbroken from Charleston, South Carolina, down through Georgia, and across the whole length of Florida to the edge of the Gulf. A continuous corridor of one man's iron, assembled out of the wreckage of other men's failures and gathered under the single roof of a holding company in New York. Where the war had left a broken and disconnected patchwork of dead lines, there was now one system, and it answered to Henry Plant. The consolidation served an end larger than ownership. By stitching the broken lines into a single continuous route and joining it to the through lines running north, Plant gave Florida's growers something they had never had: fast, cheap, reliable passage to the markets of the north. A crate of oranges picked in central Florida could now reach a table in New York in a matter of days. It was a genuine service, and it remade the state's economy. It also meant that the growers, the shippers, the whole young commerce of a region now moved on terms that one man increasingly set. He was building more than a railroad through the country he was opening. He was building the road in and the road out, and along long stretches of that country there would be no other. And at the far end of it, where the last of his rails ran down to the water, there was a place he had chosen to be the terminus of the entire design. In 1884, the tracks reached it. It was a fishing village of a few hundred people on a hot and half-forgotten bay, poor and unpaved and unremarkable in every way but one. Henry Plant had decided that it would become the door through which the modern world would enter the western half of Florida. Chapter 5. The Village at the End of the Line. When Henry Plant's rails reached Tampa in the winter of 1884, the place they reached held fewer than 800 people. It was a fishing settlement on a wide, warm bay, unpaved, mosquito-ridden, and going nowhere. A town whose overland connection to the rest of the country had for decades been essentially a wish. It was, in every ordinary sense, an unpromising terminus for a railroad, but Plant had not chosen it for what it was. He had chosen it for its bay, which was deep, and for its position, which put it among the closest points to Cuba that any American railroad could reach. He had spent his life recognizing the value in a thing that no one else had troubled to organize. He looked at the sleepy village on Tampa Bay and saw a doorway to the Caribbean that no one had thought to build. So he built it. He was not content to stop his railroad at the town. He ran it 9 miles farther, down to the very edge of the bay, and there, at a spot he named Port Tampa, he set about manufacturing a deep-water harbor out of a mudflat. He dredged the channel, drove out the docks over the shallows, and built up a terminal capable of taking ocean-going ships. Then he put ships on it. The plant steamship line began sailing from Port Tampa to Key West and to Havana, and in time to Mobile and to Jamaica, and Plant secured from the United States government the mail contract for the West Indies route, running out of Port Tampa through Key West to Havana. A crate loaded onto a Plant rail car in Georgia could now be carried the length of Florida, transferred at Port Tampa to a Plant steamship, and delivered to Cuba. Every mile of the journey, on land and on water, belonging to the same man. What came through that doorway, in both directions, remade the western half of the state. Out of Florida went the things the rails could now carry north in days instead of weeks. Citrus and lumber and cattle and celery, and, after the phosphate strikes of the late 1880s, the pale mineral wealth that Floridians came to call gray gold. In the other direction came industry and people. Plant's transportation network helped draw the cigar manufacturer Vicente Martinez Ybor to move his operation to Tampa, and around his factories rose Ybor City. A dense, thriving immigrant district of Cuban and Spanish and Italian workers hand-rolling cigars by the millions until Tampa could call itself the cigar capital of the world. A fishing village that had held a few hundred souls was becoming a city. The numbers tell the transformation plainly. Fewer than 800 people in 1880, more than 15,000 by 1900. A near 20-fold rise in 20 years. The railroad reached the town in 1884 and reached the bay 9 miles beyond it soon after. A deep-water port dredged out of a mudflat. Steamship lines running to Havana, Key West, Mobile, and Jamaica. The United States mail contract for the West Indies. An entire immigrant cigar industry drawn in and rooted. And beneath it all, a mineral boom carrying the interior's phosphate out to the world on his rails. One man had arrived at an empty bay with a railroad, and within a decade a city stood where the village had been. Plant understood that a thing is worth only what people can be persuaded to want, and so he built the machinery, and then he advertised Florida to the world. He mounted grand exhibitions of the state's produce and promise at the great expositions of the age. In Paris in 1889, in Chicago in 1893, in Atlanta in 1895, in Nashville in 1897. Presenting the swamp and pine frontier he had opened as a tropical paradise waiting to be visited. He was selling a destination now, not merely a route. He was selling the idea of Florida itself. The city he had conjured, though, moved almost entirely on his terms. The one deep-water port belonged to him, and so did the one railroad that fed it, and so did the ships that carried its trade to sea. He had made a city, and the city rose on a single line of iron that ran through a single pair of hands. For now, in the boom years of the 1880s and 90s, that concentration read only as convenience and progress. What it would mean when the whole weight of the nation someday came down on that single line at once was a question no one yet had any reason to ask. There remained one thing the doorway still lacked. A railroad could carry the wealthy northerner south, and a steamship could carry him onward to Havana, but nothing yet gave him a reason to stop in Tampa and stay. To sell Florida as a destination, Plant needed to give the traveler somewhere astonishing to arrive. And so, on the far bank of the Hillsborough River, across the water from the town he had willed into being, he began to build the most extravagant structure the western coast of Florida had ever seen. Chapter 6. The Palace on the Hillsborough. The building rose on the far bank of the Hillsborough River between 1888 and 1891, and there had never been anything like it in the American South. Plant hired a New York architect named John A. Wood, a man little known at the time, and set him to design something that would stop a traveler in his tracks. What Wood produced was a Moorish palace, a fantasy of the Alhambra, the great Islamic fortress of Granada that Plant had seen on his travels in Spain, set down whole on a Florida riverbank among the palms. On the 5th of February, 1891, the Tampa Bay Hotel opened its doors, and the swamp and pine frontier suddenly had, at its center, a 5-story vision of minarets and crescent moons. The figures behind it are difficult to absorb even now. Plant spent $2.5 million to build the hotel and a further $500,000 to furnish it, and he paid every dollar out of his own personal fortune, taking no investors at all. The building ran 1/4 of a mile from end to end, more than 900 feet, covering 6 acres of ground, on landscaped grounds of 150 acres. It had 511 rooms. It was crowned by 13 silver towers, 6 true minarets, 4 cupolas, and 3 domes. The minarets each tipped with a crescent moon in the Moorish style. It held the first elevator ever installed in Florida, still running today, among the oldest working elevators in the country. Every one of its rooms had electric light and a telephone, the first in the state to have either, and most had private baths with full-size tubs. Its grounds carried a heated indoor swimming pool, a golf course, tennis courts, a bowling alley, a racetrack and stables, and a casino with an auditorium that seated 2,000. A room ran between $5 and $15 a night, at a time when the other hotels in the town charged $1 or $2. It was, by a wide margin, the most extravagant structure the western coast of Florida had ever seen. To fill it, Plant and his second wife, Margaret, had spent the years before the opening moving through Europe and Asia on a buying campaign of almost comic excess. They shipped home Venetian mirrors and French furniture, Asian bronzes, and French porcelain and marble statuary. One vase, a personal gift from the Emperor of Japan. The art arrived, as one account put it, by the trainload, and there was so much of it that even a 1/4 mile of hotel could not hold it all. The surplus had to be sold off at auction. A guest stepping down from the train, for a rail spur ran directly to the west entrance, so that visitors disembarked and walked straight into the lobby, entered a world assembled from the gathered elegance of 2 continents. For those who could afford it, the experience belonged to a world that has since vanished entirely. Guests arrived by private rail car and dressed formally for dinner in a grand salon. An orchestra played in the music room. In the long afternoons they sat in rocking chairs along the 1/4 mile veranda, looking out over the river and the gardens, or were carried in rickshaws through the grounds, and in the evenings the electric lights of the palace burned against the dark of a frontier that had, a decade earlier, held almost nothing at all. It was the height of the American Gilded Age, rendered in brick and silver on the edge of the Gulf. A manufactured paradise for the northern rich, set down in a state most of them had never before had a reason to visit. And it lost money every year it was open. That was not a failure. It was the design. The Tampa Bay Hotel never turned a profit as a hotel, and Henry Plant never expected it to. The palace made its money long before any guest reached a room. On the railroad tickets that carried him south, the steamship fares that carried him onward to Havana, the whole long journey down the Plant system that the palace had been built to justify. The most extravagant building in Florida was an advertisement. It was a $3 million billboard for a railroad, raised in silver and imported marble, so that a man reading about it in a New York drawing room would decide that he, too, had to go and see it, and would buy his ticket to get there from Henry Plant. Everyone who looked at the Tampa Bay Hotel saw a palace. What Plant had actually built was the storefront of a machine. Behind the minarets and the crescent moons and the plundered marble ran a mechanism for moving northern money south and Florida's wealth north. And it was that mechanism, cold, efficient, and entirely his, that the silver towers had been raised to hide in plain sight. The palace was the thing the world remembered. To understand what Henry Plant had really made, it is necessary to look past it and at the machine underneath. Chapter 7. The Machine Beneath the Minarets. Strip away the minarets, and the thing Henry Plant had built stood revealed as something simpler and colder than a palace. It was a single continuous mechanism for extraction and delivery, and it ran in both directions at once. Everything the western half of Florida produced, the citrus and the cattle, the lumber and the celery, the phosphate coming up out of the interior, left the region on Plant's rails. Everything the region took in, the industry, the settlers, the wealthy northern visitors, and the money they carried with them, came in on the same rails. For much of that country there was no other way. The grower who wanted his fruit in a northern market, the manufacturer who wanted his goods shipped, the traveler who wanted to reach the Gulf, all of them dealt, in the end, with the same man, on his terms and at his rates. Plant had done more than open Florida. He had installed himself at the single valve through which it breathed. He went on tightening the web to the end of his life. In 1897 he opened yet another great hotel, the Bellevue, out on the Pinellas Peninsula near Clearwater, a rambling structure built entirely of native Florida heart pine, advertised as the largest occupied wooden building in the world, and set, like all the others, at the end of a Plant rail line so that guests could step down from the train nearly into the lobby. It was one of the 8 hotels he built or bought along the western coast, and every one of them worked the same way. A billboard, a loss leader, one more reason to buy a ticket from Henry Plant. By the late 1890s, the design was finished, a chain of palaces strung along a private railroad down a coast that one man had summoned into being and now, in every practical sense, controlled. The country noticed. In 1898, Success magazine gave Henry Plant a title. It called him the King of Florida. The magazine meant it as a tribute, a salute to the man who had conjured a state out of a swamp. But the word was more exact than the writer knew. A king is not merely a great man. A king is a single person in whom the fate of a realm is gathered, whose decisions an entire population must live by, whether or not they ever chose him. That was, with some precision, what Henry Plant had become on the western coast of Florida. The true scale of the thing shows in how few of each part there was. There was one man. There was one holding company in New York that owned the whole design. There were more than 2,100 miles of railroad and 14 chartered railway companies, but they fed a single continuous corridor down to the Gulf. There was one deep-water port at the end of it, dredged out of a mudflat, and one steamship line sailing from it, and one federal mail contract routing the West Indies through it. And into the terminus of all of it, into Tampa itself, a city of 15,000 people that had not been a city at all 15 years earlier, there ran, when it came down to it, essentially one railroad line. A whole region's commerce and a whole city's existence rested on a single thread of iron. In the boom years, no one had any reason to see that as anything but strength. A single hand meant a single efficient will. The trains ran, the fruit moved, the tourists came, and the concentration looked like nothing more sinister than good management. But a system with one artery has exactly one place where it can be stopped. Everything Plant had built, the city, the trade, the palaces, the fortunes of the thousands who had followed the rails south depended on that one line and that one port continuing to carry whatever load was laid across them. And no one had ever laid a great load on them all at once. As long as no one did, the fragility stayed invisible, hidden inside the appearance of overwhelming power. The weakness and the strength were the same fact seen from two sides, and only one of those sides had ever been tested. The man who had built the machine could see only the strength. He had spent 40 years being right about what other men had overlooked, and he had no reason left to doubt himself. It would not hold. In the spring of 1898, the entire weight of the United States government and an army bound for a foreign war would come down on Henry Plant's single railroad and his single port all at once. The one artery would be asked to carry more than any artery could. And it would happen because Henry Plant, seeing one last great opportunity in a neglected thing that no one else had thought to claim, had personally, deliberately, invited it to come. Chapter 8. The War He Invited. The opportunity arrived, as the largest ones often do, disguised as a catastrophe. On the 15th of February, 1898, the American battleship Maine exploded in Havana harbor, killing more than 250 men, and within weeks the United States was moving toward war with Spain over the island of Cuba. To most Americans, the coming war was a matter of honor and empire. To Henry Plant, it was also a matter of geography, and the geography was his. Cuba lay just off the Florida coast, and the nearest deep-water port with a railroad running to it was Port Tampa, which Plant had dredged out of a mudflat and owned outright. At the end of a railroad he also owned, beside a hotel large enough to quarter a general staff. He moved to secure it the way he secured everything. In March of 1898, Plant wrote directly to the Secretary of War, Russell Alger, pressing the case for Tampa. He sent an agent, Franklin Q. Brown, to Washington to argue it in person. He leaned on the connections inside the War Department that 4 decades in the transportation business had bought him. And it worked. Tampa was chosen as the principal port of embarkation for the invasion of Cuba, and it was chosen in large part because of Henry Plant. Because of his rails, his ships, his hotel, and his lobbying. He had arranged for a war to be routed through his own machinery. Men were going to Cuba to kill and to die, and they would travel there down Henry Plant's railroad, sleep in camps beside Henry Plant's town, and ship out from Henry Plant's port, and every mile of that passage would run through the hands of the King of Florida. For Plant, it must have looked like the crowning stroke of his career, the greatest freight contract imaginable, wrapped inside the greatest advertisement imaginable. The United States Army would be his guest, and its presence would set the name of Tampa and of the Tampa Bay Hotel on the front page of every newspaper in America. The Army came in the spring. The first soldiers arrived in April. Then the troop trains began to roll in one after another, and by the late spring of 1898, some 30,000 men were gathered in and around a town that, a year before, had held 15,000. 7 army camps sprang up across the area, at the parks, at the port, at the edge of Ybor City, in the fields west of the hotel. And the Tampa Bay Hotel itself became the headquarters of the war. The commanding generals took rooms in it. So did the war correspondents, the foreign military observers, the society figures who had come south to watch, and Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, who arrived to organize hospital care. Among the officers drilling their men on the hotel grounds was a lieutenant colonel of volunteer cavalry named Theodore Roosevelt, whose regiment, the Rough Riders, would ride out of Tampa and into the American myth. For a few strange weeks, the most extravagant hotel in the South stood full to capacity for the only time in its entire history, and what its distinguished guests mostly did was wait. The order to sail did not come, and then did not come again, and the officers of the invasion settled into the rocking chairs that lined the quarter-mile veranda and passed the days there in the heat, discussing strategy and rumor while the army swelled around them. The correspondent Richard Harding Davis, watching them, called it the rocking chair period. The locals had a blunter name for the whole affair. They called it the rocking chair war. It made a genial picture. The generals rocking on Henry Plant's veranda, the electric lights of the palace burning over an army at rest, the King of Florida hosting the nation's war from the porch of his masterpiece. It was very nearly the triumph he had built the whole machine to produce. But a picture is a still image, and a still image hides motion. While the officers rocked on the veranda above, the machine beneath them had already begun to fail. 30,000 men, and the ships and stores and animals needed to carry them to a war, had all been funneled down onto a single railroad line and a single dredged port. The one thread of iron and the one channel of water that everything in Plants, Florida, ran through. And the load laid across them was far past anything they had been built to bear. The advertisement Henry Plant had arranged for himself was about to turn into something else. It was about to become the most public demonstration in the country of exactly where and how badly his machine could break. Chapter 9. The Bottleneck. When the order to move finally came in the first days of June, the machine met the load it had been asked to carry, and the load won. Everything that Henry Plant's single line and single port had made possible now worked against him. 30,000 men and their equipment had to pass down one railroad and out through one harbor, and the one railroad and the one harbor could not do it. Troop trains backed up along the single line into Tampa until they could no longer move. At the port, the transport ships could not be loaded and cleared fast enough, and the soldiers waiting to board them piled up by the thousands in camps that had been meant to hold a fraction of their number. The commanding general, William Shafter, faced a logistical tangle that one historian would later describe as simply too complicated to unravel. Men and animals, supplies and ships, all converging on the single narrow point that Plant's entire design had been built around. The conditions inside the jam were their own indictment. The men wore heavy wool uniforms in the full weight of a Florida summer. Rations meant for an army sat uninspected on the docks in the blazing midsummer sun and rotted where they lay. Drinking water turned foul. Men and horses sickened in the heat and the crowding, and the camps that ringed the town filled with the smell of an army going bad in place while it waited for ships that were not ready. And on the night of the 6th of June, the day before the first embarkation, the violence the Army's presence had been building toward finally broke. Drunken white volunteers from an Ohio regiment seized a small black child from his mother and used him as a target for their marksmanship. The boy was not physically harmed, but the act ignited what had been gathering for weeks. Black soldiers of the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, on their way to fight for a country that quartered them in segregated camps, went into the streets, and the night ended in gunfire and wreckage, the Tampa police too few to stop it, and, by some accounts, blood on the pavement. The next morning, the men who had rioted and the men who had been abused boarded the same transports and sailed together toward a war their government said was being fought to free an oppressed people from a cruel empire. The embarkation itself measured exactly what the bottleneck cost. Of the 30,000 men gathered at Tampa, roughly 16,000 managed to board ship on the 7th of June. More than 12,000 others were simply left behind because there was not enough room on the transports to carry them. An entire Second Army stranded on the docks, watching the first one leave, and then even the 16,000 who had boarded did not leave. A rumor of a Spanish cruiser somewhere in the Gulf froze the fleet in place, and for 5 full days the transports sat motionless in Tampa Bay under a merciless sun, the food aboard them spoiling, the water going rancid, the men and animals penned below decks in the heat, until at 3:30 in the morning on the 14th of June the order came at last to sail. The numbers of that June tell the whole story of the machine's limit. 30,000 men funneled onto a single railroad line, 16,000 loaded onto ships, more than 12,000 left standing on the shore. 5 days lost to a rumor, with an army rotting at anchor in the bay. One port, one line, one dredged channel of water, asked at last to carry the entire weight of a nation's war, and buckling under it in full view of every correspondent Henry Plant had drawn to Tampa to admire him. The most public advertisement of his career had become the most public failure of his infrastructure. The machine broke at precisely the point where, for 15 years, anyone who looked closely could have seen that it would. The war, once the fleet had cleared Tampa Bay, ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Cuba fell in 10 weeks. Roosevelt got his charge and his legend. The treaty was signed before the year was out. For Tampa, the summer of 1898 was the moment the city stepped onto the world's stage, and it never entirely stepped back off. But for Henry Plant, the war that was to have been his crowning triumph had done something quieter and more lasting. It had shown the nation, and perhaps, at the very end, shown Plant himself, the outer edge of the thing he had built. He was 78 years old that summer. He had 1 year left to live, and the empire he had spent 40 years assembling out of other men's ruins was about to prove far more fragile than even the single line of rail that had failed beneath his war. Chapter 10. The Frozen Estate. Henry Plant died on the 23rd of June, 1899, in New York City, of heart disease, at the age of 79. He had outlived his war by a single year, and he died the wealthiest and most powerful man the western coast of Florida had ever produced, an estate valued at something on the order of $10 million, and an empire of rails and ships and palaces stretching across 3 states. And then he did the last thing that was truly characteristic of him. He tried to keep it. The man who had spent 40 years closing his hand around valuable things and never letting go had written a will designed to do exactly that with his entire empire, and to go on doing it after he was dead. Rather than divide his properties among his heirs, which would have meant selling off pieces and breaking the great machine back into the separate parts he had assembled it from, Plant's will placed the whole of it into a trust, to be held intact for the benefit of a grandson, a boy named Henry Plant II, who was 4 years old. The empire was not to be broken up, it was to be frozen, held whole and undivided through the long minority of a child, and passed down the generations as a single dynastic estate, precisely as its builder had left it. It was the ultimate consolidation, an attempt to reach past his own death and keep the empire in his grip from inside the grave. It did not survive contact with his own family. Plant's widow, Margaret, and his surviving son, Morton, went to court and challenged the will, and the courts of New York struck down its central provision as invalid under the laws of the state. The trust that was meant to hold the empire together for a century was broken within a few years of the funeral. The man who had built his entire fortune out of the broken estates of others now had his own estate broken in a courtroom by his own widow and his own son. With the will undone, the empire could at last be sold, and it was, almost at once. In 1902, 3 years after Henry Plant's death, the whole of the Plant system was absorbed into the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. It went in a single stroke. The more than 2,100 miles of track, the 14 railway companies, the steamship lines, the port, the hotels, the accumulated work of 40 years folded in one transaction into a larger company that kept none of his name on any of it. The price was never made public. What is known is the result. Within 3 years of his death, the Plant system had ceased to exist as the Plant system. The rails he had laid still ran and run today, carried down through a century of mergers into the freight company now called CSX. But the name of the King of Florida was gone from them, scraped off the maps and the timetables and the sides of the cars, as completely as if he had never held them. This is the answer to the question the silver minarets could never be made to give. Henry Plant was not forgotten because his work was small, or because it failed, or because time simply wore his memory smooth. His empire was dismantled deliberately, sold whole, and renamed within 3 years of his death by a combination of his own family and the ordinary machinery of inheritance law. And an empire that carries no name leaves no name behind. Flagler's imprint stayed fixed to the coast he built, in the county and the college and the towns that still bear his name across the eastern half of the state. Plant's system was folded into another company's and vanished, and his name went with it. The difference between the remembered Henry and the forgotten one was not the scale of what they made. It was what became of it in the 3 years after they died. The empire, then, was gone within 1,000 days of its builder. But 2 things had survived the dissolution and would outlast Henry Plant by more than 100 years: his only son and his palaces. And the strange fates of both, across the century that followed, would end up saying more about what he had truly built and what it had truly cost than the vanished empire ever could. Chapter 11. The Pearl and the Mansion. Morton Freeman Plant had stood at his father's side in the business for years, vice president of the Plant Investment Company, a steady hand inside the machine. And it was Morton, together with his father's widow, who broke the old man's will and sold the empire into the Atlantic coastline. What he received in return was not an empire, it was money, and money, unlike an empire, does not have to be run, it only has to be spent. Morton spent it in the manner of his age and his class. He kept a great steam yacht and raced it. He owned a share of the Philadelphia Baseball Club and the whole of a minor league club up in New London. He gave generously to hospitals and to colleges, $1 million at a single stroke to a women's college in Connecticut, and on Fifth Avenue in New York, on the corner of 52nd Street, in the heart of the row of mansions the city called Millionaire's Row, he built himself a palace of marble and limestone, a northern echo of the thing his father had raised in silver on the Hillsborough River, and, like it, a monument to a fortune that no longer had anything left to build. Then the city moved on around him. By the 19-teens, the great houses of Millionaire's Row were being overtaken by commerce. The old families were drifting north, and shopfronts were replacing drawing rooms. And in 1914, Morton, by then past 60, married a woman named May Caldwell Manwaring, known to everyone as Maisie, many years his junior and possessed of a very keen eye for beautiful things. In 1917, that eye settled on a necklace. It was a Cartier piece, A double strand of 128 natural pearls, 55 in one row and 73 in the other, gathered by hand from the sea over years and matched with a care that, in the age before cultured pearls, made them among the most precious objects money could buy. Cartier had priced the necklace at $1 million. And Pierre Cartier, who wanted a Fifth Avenue address as badly as Maisie Plant wanted the pearls, proposed a trade. He would give the Plants the necklace and $100 in cash besides in exchange for their mansion, the Marble Palace on the corner. In July of 1917, the deal was entered into the real estate record. The Morton Plant House, sold to the Cartier firm for, in the language of the register, $100 and other valuable considerations. The other valuable considerations were a string of pearls. Cartier's flagship store stands in that mansion still, on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, more than a century later. It is, in its way, the most enduring monument the plant fortune ever produced. Not a railroad, not a port, not a city, but a jewelry store, keeping shop in the house that Henry Plant's son traded away for a necklace. The empire that had once carried the freight of a nation had come down, in a single generation, to this: a strand of pearls, and the deed to a townhouse passed across a counter. Morton Plant did not live to grow old in whatever house he took next. He died in November of 1918, a little over a year after the trade. The last of the Plants to have held any hand in the enterprise his father built. And the pearls did not keep their worth either. Maisie kept them until her own death decades later, and when they went to auction in the 1950s, the world had shifted beneath them. Cultured pearls had arrived and made natural ones ordinary, and the necklace that had once been valued at $1 million and had bought a mansion on Fifth Avenue sold for something nearer a fifth of that. The most precious object the fortune ever purchased had quietly become one of the least. Everything the plant money touched, once the empire behind it was gone, seemed to lose its value in the keeping. Only the buildings held. The sun was dead, the fortune scattered, the empire absorbed, the pearls dispersed. And still, back on the far bank of the Hillsborough River, the silver minarets stood exactly where Henry Plant had raised them, waiting to become the one thing about him that time would not take away. Chapter 12. The Silver Minarets. The end of the hotel came the way the end of that whole gilded world came with the Depression. Tourism collapsed after 1929, and in 1930 the Tampa Bay Hotel closed its doors as a hotel for the last time. For 3 years the great Moorish palace stood empty on the riverbank, its 511 rooms dark, its silver minarets rising over nothing, a quarter-mile of shuttered grandeur with no one left to fill it. It might easily have become the start of the same slow ruin that swallows most abandoned monuments. It did not. In the summer of 1933, a small and struggling junior college was given permission to move into the empty building and hold its classes in the rooms that had once been suites. The college grew there, and in growing became something larger, the University of Tampa, which has occupied the old hotel ever since. The city of Tampa, which by then owned the building, leased it to the university on a long lease at a rent of $1 a year. The palace that Henry Plant had built to be the most exclusive address in the state, $5 to $15 a night, in a town where the other hotels charged $1 or $2, passed to a public university for a single dollar a year, and its rooms filled again, this time with students. Much of what Plant made is still there to be walked through. One wing of the old hotel was set aside as a museum, and it survives today as the Henry B. Plant Museum, holding the rooms and the imported furnishings as the first guests would have seen them. The first elevator ever installed in Florida still runs, carrying students between floors more than a century and a quarter after it was built. In the grand dining room where generals and diplomats once ate, a young ball player named Babe Ruth signed a contract, and in a field beside the hotel in 1919, he hit one of the longest home runs anyone had ever seen. The building, raised to sell railroad tickets to the very rich, became, in the end, a place where anyone at all could walk in and stand beneath the minarets, a private advertisement turned into a public commons, still doing useful work long after the empire it had advertised was gone. The others did not all last. Of the 8 hotels Henry Plant built or bought along the western coast, the Tampa Bay Hotel is the grand survivor. But the Bellevue, the vast wooden palace out on the Pinellas Peninsula, proved the most durable of all as a working hotel. It kept its doors open, under one owner and then another, for more than a century, outliving Plant and his son and his empire, and nearly everyone who had ever ridden a Plant train to reach it. It closed at last in 2009, and after years of failed rescues, most of it was pulled down in 2016, its century-old heart pine carried off and milled into other things. A single wing was saved, and stands today as a small inn, a fragment of the last great Plant hotel, kept alive beside the condominiums that took the place of the rest. And so the accounts close unevenly. The empire is gone, folded a century ago into a company most Floridians could not name. The fortune scattered into yachts and pearls and dissolved. The title a magazine once fixed to a whole coast, the King of Florida, survives on a small farming town, a museum wing, and the hall the students pass through without looking up. Down the opposite shore, the other Henry's name still marks a county, a college, and the resort city he built, remembered as the man who made Florida, while the man who made the other half of it stands almost wholly in his shadow. The two of them raced each other down opposite coasts of the same state, built the same kind of empire in the same years out of the same ambition, and history, which is not always just and is rarely tidy, kept one of them and quietly let the other go. What remains of Henry Plant is not his power, which is gone, and not his fortune, which dispersed, and not his name, which was scraped from the rails. What remains is the silver he raised over a fishing village to catch the eye of strangers. 13 towers and their crescent moons, still standing on the bank of the Hillsborough River, still catching the Gulf light, now sheltering a world of ordinary students who will never know whose kingdom they are studying inside. The King of Florida is forgotten. His palace is not. On most evenings the minarets still glow above the river, the grandest surviving monument to a vanished empire, keeping a kind of watch over a city that has long since forgotten it was ever ruled by a king. One last word, from me to you. Henry Plant built a kingdom out of other men's ruins and then lost it, name and all, within 3 years of his death. And the only thing of his that outlasted him is the one palace he never meant to keep. If you have walked beneath those minarets, studied inside them, or know a town that still carries an old plant depot at the end of a street, tell me below. Those are the details the histories leave out, and this channel is built partly from them. Tell me, too, whose forgotten empire we ought to walk through next. And if the story of the other Henry was worth your evening, consider subscribing and staying with the work.